You have Dr. Paul Saladino on one side. You have Dr. Peter Attia on the other side. And on the surface, with what you see on the internet, you would think that there's very little they actually agree on. However, when I interviewed them both in separate situations, they both referenced one particular study and actually have a very similar opinion on it. And it's the entire piece of the equation that people debate about. And that is, does caloric restriction actually matter for longevity, or is it more about nutrient quality? Now, if you were to ask them independently, you might get two very different answers, but with little flares of what's similar. However, it's interesting to see how they both address this one particular study that was conducted by the National Institute of Aging. And we'll get into that, and I'll actually share the clip from Dr. Peter Attia, and I'll share the clip from Dr. Paul Saladino. But I want to give context and provide nuance between these two clips. So let's go ahead and break it down. And after today's video, I put a link down below for 25% off of Seed's Daily Synbiotic. This is a probiotic and a prebiotic in one capsule. So it literally has a capsule inside of a capsule. This is so that you potentially have better delivery. So you have kind of the multi-staging approach there. So having that capsule inside of a capsule makes it so you're delivering the prebiotic and then you're staging the probiotic potentially in a better way. Now, out of all the probiotics that are out there, this is probably the only one that I would ever use. Most of them have very limited amounts of strains and quite honestly are garbage. So Seed puts their money where their mouth is. They conduct their own research, even if it doesn't benefit their company, which is why I stand behind them. Their morals are there and the product itself is second to none. So that link down below is a 25% off discount to try Seed. You will probably notice the benefits within 4 or 5 days. It hits that quick. So that link, top line of the description underneath this video. So the study that Dr. Paul Saladino and Dr. Peter Attia both talked about in similar context was this study that took a look at Rhesus monkeys. And again, I'll cut to the clips in a second, but essentially they took two groups of monkeys. It was one of the largest scale studies done in aging in the world. And as Peter mentions, it'll probably never be replicated. It is huge, and we're just not going to be investing that kind of money into monkey studies anymore. So what they looked at was monkeys that consumed a really cruddy diet versus monkeys that consumed a more normal, appropriate diet for what these monkeys would eat in real life. Essentially what they found is that caloric deficits did not improve the longevity of these monkeys unless the diet was really bad. So let's go ahead and let's cut to Peter Attia's take on this first. It's very, very interesting coming from sort of a longevity expert, someone that's very seasoned in this world. So let's cut to that and hear what he has to say.
But if you look at the mice literature, there's no question that caloric restriction is the most reproducible intervention from a nutrition perspective that pertains to elongating life. The only other intervention, frankly, that is as consistent in the mouse literature is the use of a drug called rapamycin. But let's put that aside because we're talking about nutrition. Now, conversely, when you look at the largest study that was ever done on this topic, it was done in Rhesus monkeys. And it's a study that was Herculean. It'll never be done again. There will never be this much of an investment in time and money to address this question. And in some people's eyes, it was a total failure. But it's so interesting that it occupies probably half a chapter in that book, which is the monkeys of Madison, Wisconsin, and Bethesda, Maryland, right? So the National Institutes of Aging ran a near 20-year study from the, probably the late 80s into the late noughts, where they looked at caloric restriction across these two species, or these species of monkeys in these two locations. These were basically meant to be parallel studies. So they weren't testing different hypotheses, but because they were designed differently, I think we learned two different things. So the question was, if you calorically restrict a group of monkeys, do they live longer? And the answer turned out to be, it depends what your alternative eating solution is. And in what initially looked like a failure of the study, because the two studies showed different things, on closer examination, I think suggested what I just said. So in Wisconsin, the monkeys were fed a diet that was more meant to replicate the standard American diet. And in particular, it consisted of about 28 or 29% sucrose by weight. By calories, not by weight. So even more egregious. That's actually pretty extreme. That's even more extreme, I would argue. I don't think the average American is getting 30% of their calories from sugar. So this was a really bad diet. And in that situation, the calorically restricted monkeys indeed lived longer. In Bethesda, the experiment was done with a diet that was meant to more adequately replicate what these monkeys would eat in the wild. And in that experiment, the calorically restricted animals did not live longer. And there's a lot more detail to this that I won't go into just for the sake of time, but the takeaway, I think, was the worse your diet, the more caloric restriction will help you. So that is major takeaway number one. I think another takeaway has to be constant versus intermittent caloric restriction and what this looks like in the wild. Because the limitation of all these animal studies is these animals are insulated from at least two significant sources of morbidity and mortality that humans face when we age. And that is trauma and infection. So, falling and all the things associated with sarcopenia are a real problem for our species once we hit the 7th decade of life. And that's less of an issue for these monkeys for several reasons, but at least the two most important, I would argue, are their genes, which is primates are far more muscular than we are, and they tend to be far better at converting excess energy into lean mass versus fat mass. We don't. Secondly, they're caged and housed internally in a relatively sterile environment. So my 2 cents on this is that if we ever ran the experiment in humans, which we can't do, right? The lifelong experiment of caloric restriction versus not caloric restriction, we would probably see something quite similar, which is if we ran several arms and we took the all McDonald's diet and the controls ate 4,000 calories of McDonald's diet every day, and the CR group only was allowed 1,800 calories of the McDonald's diet every day, they would absolutely live longer. If you did it on let's go to Whole Foods and the controls are eating 3,000 calories of Whole Foods every day and the calorically restricted are 1,800 of Whole Foods every day, I'm not convinced you'd see much of a difference. And I think the gap would be even narrower based on those other factors around muscle mass. In fact, I might argue that the calorically restricted group on the good diet might live shorter.
Now, what's interesting that Peter didn't go into a ton of detail about after this clip was the fact that most rodent model studies really do show that caloric restriction works. So when they're in a very controlled situation, caloric restriction does seem to be beneficial for longevity. But where does this start to come into play when we start looking at the blue zones and whatnot? For a long time, we talked about the Okinawans and other blue zones as being, hugely successful when it comes down to number of centenarians, their longevity, because they would eat in a caloric deficit. Okinawans, on average, would eat in about a 15% deficit. So does it mean that the deficit really doesn't matter as much? Well, I think the deficit matters a lot, and we see it in the rodent models. But if the Okinawans ate such a good diet, why was the deficit so important for them? Because as we've seen with what Peter said, is maybe the deficit doesn't matter if the diet is good. However, with the Okinawans, we can't say with absolute certainty that it's the deficit that was giving them the benefit, right? Maybe it was their lifestyle, maybe it was their level of stress, maybe it was the amount of fiber they were eating. Maybe all of these things just led to a little bit more caloric restriction, but it wasn't really the caloric restriction that was giving them the benefit. Now, I want to cut over to Dr. Paul Saladino's take. Now, if you don't know Dr. Paul Saladino, he formerly was a carnivore person. He was only eating meat and animal products. And then recently he shifted a couple of years ago to having fruit and being very pro-insulin and kind of having, anyway, his entire take is about nutrient quality. Processed food shouldn't be in existence. We shouldn't be consuming these things. We should just be consuming very pure, down-to-earth foods. And I think at the heart of it, A lot of people align with that. Maybe they don't align with Paul's extreme take on things and maybe some of his aggression towards this whole topic, but a lot of people do agree that, hey, eating close to the earth is probably good. Now, Paul takes a little bit more of an extreme stance when he talks about the phytotoxins and oxalates and things like that that are in plants. We'll table that for another day because that's not really relevant to this particular discussion. But here's where Paul on my channel talks about this same exact study in a very similar context to Dr. Peter Attia. So without even knowing it, they're both referencing a similar study. So here's Paul's take on this, and they'll kind of recap it.
So we talk about caloric restriction first. I don't think everybody in the longevity space is doing caloric restriction, but I know some prominent people are eating less than 2,000 calories a day at 5'10" or 6 feet and 180, 190 pounds. That's crazy, right? You and I eat 3,000 to 3,700 calories a day. So some people might look at me and say, you're not gonna live a long time, you need to do caloric restriction. But if you look at the animal studies around caloric restriction, when I dove into this, what I found that was really interesting and kind of loops back to this ancestral framework is that, especially in primates, which are perhaps Rhesus monkeys are the closest to us as humans, there is one study from the University of Minnesota that showed, or the University of Wisconsin, that showed that caloric restriction did extend lifespan. But there's another study from the National Institutes of Aging which showed that caloric restriction did not extend lifespan in the same type of monkey, Rhesus monkeys. And so what was the difference between them? This is really interesting. The National Institutes of Aging study, where there was no lifespan extension with caloric restriction, were feeding monkeys an evolutionarily appropriate diet. They were feeding them what they were supposed to be eating. In the study with Rhesus monkeys at the University of Wisconsin, they were fed monkey chow, which is basically the equivalent of rat chow, right? So some mixture of processed carbohydrates, gluten, seed oils, and garbage carbohydrates in connection with the other processed carbohydrates, right? So if you're feeding, you can look across animals, basically from rodents, mice, rats, to, I don't know what other animals you want to look in the longevity space, to monkeys of certain types, and say, yeah, caloric restriction may improve outcomes, but you're feeding them less of garbage. So it doesn't make any sense. But the study at the National Institutes of Aging was so clarifying, because if you are actually feeding a Rhesus monkey what it's supposed to eat, and you give them less of it, they have negative outcomes in some space. I mean, we know this from the fasting literature, from the weight loss literature, from the bodybuilding literature, that if you restrict calories and you're restricting nutrients in a human being and you're giving them what they're supposed to be eating, that's going to have problems in terms of hormones. You're gonna see your hormones tank. You're gonna see your hormones go down. Your testosterone, which is associated with longevity, which is associated with strength and resilience and recovery from muscle exertion. So these are not things you want to have happen. If you're thinking about longevity, I think you need to think about longevity of your brain, of your testicles, of your ovaries, of your sexual function, of your ability to enjoy your life, longevity of your mental health, longevity of your ability to withstand stress because you want to do cool things in your life. Do you want to go surf? Do you want to go hike a mountain? Do you want to climb? You're gonna fall and skin your knee. You want longevity of recovery also. And so I think that these caloric restriction arguments are just completely ill-conceived and false. They're based on incorrectly interpreted literature, because what you're going to get with caloric restriction is tanking your hormones, frailty, and then increasing your trajectory toward basically decrepitude.
Okay, so clearly we're seeing, at least based upon this literature, that if you're eating good, solid, clean food, you don't get a heck of a lot of benefit from caloric restriction. But you also are likely self-governing. When you're eating really clean, it's hard to get into that extreme surplus. A, because the food would just be harder to eat, but B, your system is probably able to regulate and govern better, so you're not going to overeat as much, which obviously is going to cause some issues. But where we really have to run into like the big discussion here is, what is the best thing to be discussing to the masses? Obviously, caloric restriction becomes increasingly more important the worse the diet is. But the world doesn't exactly eat a good diet. So in matter of context, maybe caloric restriction is what we should be focusing on the most, right? If we start factoring in socioeconomic issues, sociodemographics, all these different things, and we realize what kind of food people can afford, we do have to be realistic in that the best way to explain how they're going to lose weight might just be to reduce calories. However, then we leave a lot of really important stuff on the table not being discussed. Because if we could start emphasizing nutrient quality more, maybe that would encourage people to naturally start eating less. But if we encourage eating more nutrient-dense foods, we're also encouraging, unfortunately, foods that are typically more expensive and harder for people to obtain, especially when you're starting to look at middle America and you're starting to look at these regions that just eat a load of processed food and fast food to begin with. You're talking major lifestyle disruption and economic disruption, financial hardship for these people to eat like this. Now, the question comes to be, if people were metabolically healthy first, then would caloric restriction even be necessary? Do people need to restrict calories first, get the weight off, and then start to increase the amount of nutrient-dense foods that they eat? Or is there a way to do them both in tandem? I find this very interesting that, again, relatively, I don't want to say polar opposites, but relatively opposing views on many things can come together on what seems to be just about the most important topic when it comes down to what we eat as far as longevity. Now, I think they're both right. When you ask me, I think they're both coming at it from a different perspective. Paul is coming at it from a perspective of, hey guys, this is a no-brainer, like eat what's close to the earth. Whereas Peter's coming at it with a little bit more nuance as far as this is what the scientific method has demonstrated over the years. But perhaps we can take both of those and intertwine them. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.